Welcome to our channel. In this video, I am going to explain the movie, titled The Invasion, released in the year 2007. The movie begins with crash of a space shuttle in the US causing widespread devastation. People are hesitant to touch its debris because they believe it's contaminated. A man named Tucker Kaufman, who is the head of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, examines the incident and becomes sick. After he returns home and goes to sleep, strange cellular condensation forms on his face. Kaufman has a son, named Oliver, living with his ex-wife Carol, a psychiatrist. While sleeping, Oliver freaks out due to a nightmare. But fortunately, Carol is home, who comforts him and administers him medication. Next morning Kaufman calls Carol and demands custody of his son, but Carol refuses and hangs up. Then after dropping Oliver off at school, she runs into her best friend Dr. Ben Driscoll, who informs her many scientists' resignations, who believe there's a reason for the catastrophe. However, Carol shares with him her concerns about Kaufman, who is trying to take custody of her son. To which Ben says that Kaufman, being father, has every right to meet his son. Ben drops Carol off in front of her office, and reminds her of a dinner party the next day. In the next scene Carol is seen meeting Wendy Link, who informs her about her husband Richard's strange behavior. She tells that when their dog detected something unusual, Richard killed him without any remorse. Carol gets shocked on this, but she can do nothing more than prescribing some new medications for Richard. Afterwards, in the Halloween evening, Carol and her friend Pam take their children around the neighborhood for trick-or-treating. As they approach one of the houses, their family dog starts barking continuously, and then sparing everyone else, attacks Andy. But Andy, instead of trying to retreat, grabs the dog and squeezes its mouth until it's separated. Shortly, Carol arrives and after checking Andy, confirms that the kid is unharmed despite him having blood on his neck. Later, she discusses Andy's behavior with Pam, who confirms that Andy has been acting unusual for some time. Meanwhile, Carol discovers an unusual piece of skin patch on Oliver's hand. She immediately breaks it to Ben's hospital, where his colleague Dr. Stephen Galliano begins the experiments. Somewhere else, in a conference, while describing the new life-threatening flu virus to fellow scientists, Kaufman is seen advocating an ovulation program to stem the spread. Whereas, several infected waiters are seen spitting into the teacups before serving it to the scientists attending the conference. The next day, Wendy's husband Richard visits Carol in her office inquiring about Wendy. On calling Wendy's number, Carol finds out that she's on her way. However, on realizing that her husband is present there, Wendy notifies Carol that she won't be attending the session. Instead, she'll be staying at her sister's home for a few days, to stay away from Richard. The same night, while on their way to Kaufman's, Oliver and Carol are stopped by a panicked woman, warning everyone about an incoming danger. Suddenly a car runs her over the lady. Carol comes out of her car, and informs a cop that she wishes to testify as a witness to the accident. But the cop ignores her request and orders her to leave the place. Shortly after, Carol drops Oliver off at Kaufman's for the weekend, telling him to contact her frequently and take his medicines on time. Later, Carol and Ben are seen attending a party where they Czech diplomat Dr. Henryk Belisek and his wife Ludmila Belisek, who adore them and think they'd make an excellent couple. Afterwards, they encounter a Russian diplomat named Yorish, who joins Carol in discussing human nature's dark sides. After the party, while going to take Carol home, Ben tries to kiss her in the car, but Carol backs off, saying that she doesn't want to jeopardize their friendship. While at home alone, a stranger tries to force his way into the home, but Carol courageously fights him off and locks herself in. Before calling Ben for help, Ben comes over in the morning and suggests Carol stay at home, but she refuses, saying that she has several clients to see that day. While on her way to office, Carol notices people in cars staring at her strangely. She also notices several people standing and staring into nothingness as if they were soulless. On arriving at her office, she's shocked to know that all her patients have canceled their appointments for the day. Then she calls Wendy, because she hasn't kept up with some of her appointments. But instead of Wendy, Richard picks up the phone and informs her that Wendy will call her later, as she's asleep. Carol becomes concerned, thinking Richard might have done something wrong to Wendy. Frustrated with what's going on as of late, Carol searches on the internet about the weird incidents, and finds out that a lot of people have been searching for similar events. In the meanwhile, her assistant Carly approaches her with a cup of tea. But Carol, sensing something was wrong with her assistant, refuses to take the tea and asks Carly to go out. Meanwhile, Ben calls to inform her that Dr. Stephen has finished the skin patch examination. Therefore, Carol reaches the lab, where Dr. Stephen explains that the sample is a spore that takes over the brain during sleep. and alters the genetic code, making a person act strangely. Just then, Ludmila calls Ben to inform him of Yorish's strange behavior. Hence, Carol, Ben, and Steven rush to Belisec's house. They find Yorish asleep with severe cellular condensation on his face. While Carol attempts to take his picture for analysis, Yorish wakes up suddenly and attacks her. However, Ben intervenes and saves Carol. Afterwards, Yorish crawls on the floor for a while, then vomits a weird liquid and passes away. Steven takes his blood sample for experiment, while Carol rushes to Kaufman's to get Oliver. On reaching there, she finds Kaufman having a meeting with his colleagues, all of whom are acting strangely. Carol is worried about her son, though Kaufman assures her that Oliver is okay at his friend Jean's house, but Carol isn't convinced. Thus, she starts packing Oliver's belongings, but suddenly Kaufman and his colleagues surround her. Kaufman tells her that once they inoculate her, she will be just like them, without irrational emotions. Carol tries to escape, but Kaufman grabs her to the ground and infects her with his saliva. Afterwards, she somehow manages to escape and reaches Jean's house to get her son, where she only finds Jean's mother killed by the virus. Terrified, Carol starts driving recklessly, causing a minor accident. After which, when her car doesn't restart, she gets out. Then suddenly nearby people start chasing her. Fortunately, Carol manages to flee. Then she approaches a subway station and gets on the train. There too she notices the passengers with the same empty expressions. In the meantime, she receives a message from Oliver asking for help, as Kaufman has taken him somewhere. Concerned, Carol tries to ask for his location, but the message fails to send. While Carol cries in despair, a man quietly tells her that she must act emotionless to remain safe. Suddenly a gang of infected people board the train and attack the passengers. Carol exits the train and tries to save a girl but fails. Afterwards, she encounters an infected man at the railway station, but before he attacks her, Carol kills him. Then she rushes back to the road, where some cops are forcing innocent people to be inoculated. While Carol watches this, an uninfected cop, after noticing sweat on her face, approaches and asks her to flee. This indicates that the infected people do not sweat. On reaching the required home, Carol discovers that it's empty with no signs of Oliver. Terrified, she rushes over to the Belisec's house to meet Ben, where they decide to stay awake thinking they might have been affected. Later, Ben decides to go with Carol to find her son, while Dr. Steven and his assistant prepare to travel to Fort Detrick, Maryland to find a cure for the virus. In the meantime, they see Dr. Henrique coming with more inoculated individuals to infect the rest of the house. Thus, the group flees before they're attacked. While on way to find Oliver, Ben and Carol see some cops forcefully trying to inoculate Wendy. Strangely, Wendy seems to be unaffected by the virus even after sleeping several times. Thus, Carol assumes Wendy immune to the virus. Therefore, they go to Carol's office to review Wendy's medical report, where Ben discovers that Wendy is suffering from a brain illness called encephalitis, which blocks the virus from entering her brain, thus making her immune. On this, Carol suddenly realizes that Oliver is also suffering from the same illness and wonders if he is immune. In the meantime, Dr. Steven calls and informs Ben that they've arrived at Fort Detrick and have started their research on the cure. He also advises the duo to leave the area before the cops inoculate them forcefully. Meanwhile, Oliver again texts Carol and informs that he's being kept at his grandmother's home in Baltimore. Carol gets worried and reveals to Ben that Kaufman has already infected her with the virus. Therefore, she's afraid of losing both Ben and Oliver by falling asleep. In the next scene, Ben somehow succeeds in evading the infected cops and drops off Carol at the station to go their separate ways. When Carol boards the train to Baltimore, she realizes that all the people are infected. More surprisingly, Jean is also among them, who tries to warn people that Carol is simply acting as infected. Thus, Carol makes up an excuse to sleep alone, but later, when skeptical Jean comes to check on her, with no options left, Carol removes her shirt and surprisingly notices skin patches on her body. And we see that Carol has already started cellular condensation, and that now she will get infected once she falls asleep. Anyhow, this convinces Jean, thus he leaves. At station, Kaufman greets Carol and Jean and takes them to his mother's house. There, Carol manages to see Oliver while Kaufman is out. Oliver tells his mother that he's still uninfected despite sleeping every day. But then suddenly Jean shows up and confronts Carol about his speculations that Carol was only pretending to be infected. Thus, to protect Oliver and herself, Carol knocks Jean unconscious and runs away with Oliver. But unfortunately, Kaufman notices the situation from outside and chases them with his colleagues. In the meantime, Carol and Oliver manage to hide in an abandoned location, but Kaufman finds and attacks them. And after a short scuffle, Carol eventually kills him by hitting him with an iron rod, getting rid of him once and for all. Then Carol and Oliver reach a pharmacy. Carol takes some injections and pills to prevent herself from falling asleep. Then, she calls Ben to inform him about their location. Meanwhile, Oliver is seen trying to open the pharmacy's storeroom door. Carol goes inside and finds pharmacy's employees lying there unconscious. Sensing they're infected, she quietly grabs a gun from one of them and locks the door again. After a while, Oliver falls asleep. Carol again takes some medicines to stay awake. But despite her best efforts, she eventually falls asleep. In the morning, all the infected employees of the pharmacy, on regaining consciousness, try to get out of the storeroom. Due to their commotion, Oliver wakes up and finds Carol lying down. Realizing that she's infected, Oliver injects her some medicine and saves her. In the next scene, Carol becomes happy on Ben's arrival. But unfortunately, her happiness turns short-lived as she learns that Ben is also infected. Ben tries to persuade Carol to join him and the others in a new society with no crime or war. He also opens the door to let out the infected employees, and claims that immune people like Oliver would not be able to survive in the inoculated population. Then, the infected people try to apprehend Oliver, but Carol shoots all of them dead. She also shoots Ben in the leg and run away. But while trying to escape with Oliver in a cop car, a bunch of infected people surround them. However, luckily, Dr. Steven arrives, rescues them in a helicopter to a medical center. Finally, scientists succeed in making a vaccine against the virus. The whole world is soon administered with it, and the strange virus is eradicated within a year. The world reverts back to normal once again. Then, in an interview, Dr. Steven is seen revealing that the vaccinated people will not have any memories of the earlier events. And the movie ends, while Oliver's seen leaving with Jean for their school, and Ben reading the newspaper, with no memory of being infected. That's all from the movie. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like and share with friends. Also hit the subscribe button for more interesting content. See you next time with a new movie. Take care.